One. Happy Monday.
How's it going, Joe? How was your weekend? How was Wyoming?
It was a lot of fun. It's kind of windy and cold up in the mountains there, but yeah, it was nice just to hang out in a quiet cabin. It's really interesting. When I'm up there, have you ever heard like pure silence before?
When I was up there last year, right?
Yeah, so it's almost eerie, and then it's pitch black at night. It's one of the darkest areas of the country, so it's kind of cool to go watch stars. But
Yeah,
yeah,
especially yours are changing so much. I mean, I think you've been in like the climbing community so long that you've seen this, right? Where it used to be that climbing was this very niche sport and you go out and you'd be the only ones, or maybe you'd run into people once in a while. And now it's everything is crowded in Utah. So getting out there to a truly remote location is a different experience.
yeah, for sure. So yeah, and I was thinking about some stuff over the weekend we're uh, as we're wont to do, and yeah, ELT and ETL. For some reason, being in the middle of nowhere made me think of that because I guess I'm just insane or something. So, um,
Or you run a
but
business, right? So you can't walk away from that, not entirely. Yeah.
yeah, mind on your money and money on your mind. So, um,
More money, more
yeah, but
fun.
it's an interesting one. It, some circles are definitely proclaiming the death of like ETL, for example, or um, and then ELT is going to take its place. But it kind of got me thinking over the weekend, like you can't really escape, I guess, ETL. You basically can move your data sources around, but at the end of the day, you're still extracting and transforming and loading it somewhere, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I think the other problem with this terminology is that the term ETL was freighted with a lot of assumptions, and ETL is still going to be around. It comes with a new set of assumptions than it used to. So I think the old version of ETL, for the very traditional data warehouse, was that you took this raw data, you hypernormalized it, and then you discarded the raw data because storing the raw data was expensive. And I think with the modern set of tools that are starting to emerge, I think first of all, we'll see a reemergence of ETL for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. And second, you're not stuck with those assumptions anymore. So you're not necessarily hyper normalizing anymore. You're partially going to normalize, but only when it makes sense because you don't have to like make the data really tiny to fit into your database anymore. And second, you're going to keep your raw data around so you can always retransform all your history if you need to, which most
mhm.
companies do at some point. So,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean the evolution of modern cloud data warehouses have definitely, I think, um, given you the ability to port your data over and just stage it, right? And so that's the big advantage. And I suppose that's also where ELT, started coming into fashion. I remember seeing that, it was Fivetran. It hit me up in like 2015, I think, or something. And at the time, they'd mentioned, oh, well, why don't you just load all your data into a staging area in Redshift? And I was like, but that seems like sacrilege. Like, why would you do that? Why can't you just transform your data and then load it into your data warehouse? Then you start thinking about it, and you're like, yeah, like, why not? Just totally go do that.
well,
So.
some of our clients have really been using an ELT paradigm for the last 20 years, probably. I mean, in some sense, this was one of the pitches with Teradata, right? Back in the early 2000s when it was very scalable for the time before Hadoop got going. And you could just stick your data in there and then transform it. Like you could use a basic transform tool to do it, or a basic extract tool to move the data over, and then just handle all your transformations directly in SQL.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, seeing the evolution of tools like,
Yeah.
the incumbents like Informatica, for example, or your Talons, that I think, used to be pure ETL tools,
Right.
and now, they're sort of taking more of a, they're trying to become more of an ELT flavor, but
Right.
you got things like Matillion, which are just naturally natively ELT from day
Yeah.
one. Same with Fivetran and DBT and so forth. So that's kind of cool to see.
Yeah, and
So
then other tools like it used to be Hadoop, right? And people would say that Hadoop was ELT. I think you could argue about that terminology, but now it's more Spark and now like Google Cloud Data Flow, which is Apache Beam. And those tools, you could really call them ELT or ETL. So especially where you're kind of using your data lake for the transformation phase and then pushing into a database like Snowflake, Redshift, or BigQuery, that's kind of an ETL paradigm, right? You end up splitting hairs if you really try to differentiate at that point.
hmm Yeah, exactly. So it'd be like ELTL or something like
I think,
so.
I think one thing we've been discussing since we started the company is that maybe the terms ETL and ELT are kind of outmoded. I think we just need to adopt the term data pipeline now.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
it encompasses everything, right? And it encompasses everything in your cloud and your on-prem is just data pipelines, whatever system it happens to pass through. And maybe that's the big improvement we've seen is that there's just more, you can assume more integration between all these tools than you used to be able to with the traditional, like very rigid either ELT or ETL paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Or like a BLT or something, like batch load and transform. I don't know, right? So, um, but dun, dun, dun. But yeah, data pipelines I think is probably a better way to frame the discussion, because again, it's hyper confusing. I think people sometimes pick religious arguments over you know, different positions of three letters, which is kind of silly, but it is what it is. You got your staunch old school data warehousing people who are, you know, fanatical about everything still has to be done, you know, ETL. And I don't know. I mean, it seems like
Hypernormalization,
it's sort of, what's that?
hypernormalization of all data, right? Everything
Yeah.
our schema according to a very rigid set of specifications. And I think really that's what's dying, right? It's not that normalization is dying, but like the rigidity is going away gradually.
Yeah, you got a lot more flexibility these days.
And you
So,
should
I mean,
use the right tool for the job.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't think we see as much, you know, waterfall planning as we used to, you know, with respect to data modeling and normalization. It's because you don't need to. I mean, loading your data, loading your raw data into a data warehouse, for example, I mean, that offers you a ton of flexibility, especially if you don't know your data that well. I think it's a bit foolish to, uh, you know, preemptively try and model your data before you know, transform it and everything. It's just, but that was an old practice, right? Like you just have this giant committees and all this other crap. So, but you don't need it anymore.
Well, the reality is, think about the two big drivers of big data back in the early 2000s, log files coming off of servers and trying to scan all the text on the web. Well, neither of those things lend themselves readily to any kind of normalization, right? Like, how are you going to normalize all these logs coming from 50 different servers that you're running back in the day? Big server farm. And so, yeah, it was time to think in terms of a new paradigm, in terms of more scanning data than trying to pick it apart.
Mm-hmm. I've seen some attempts. I know Bill Inman had something I saw on LinkedIn where he talked about like textual something or other, like some ETL paradigm. I'm totally gonna butcher it now. You know, so it's trying to do like text analysis within, you know, the data warehouse or data mart model, but it's, but again, is that even the right tool for the job in that case, or are you better off just using what companies like Google and similar have
Right.
basically built their business around?
Right. And it's kind of interesting, actually. I mean, think about where BigQuery came from. So Google these days pitches BigQuery as fundamentally a data warehouse, right? Or a big data warehouse. It's a data warehouse that can scale. But that was created as a log scanning tool. Now, from my perspective, you can actually do quite a bit of text analytics in SQL. But at some point, you hit a wall where it's like, this is just not the right programming language. So for example, I think that I could probably, with a lot of work, make stemming and tokenization and text normalization work in SQL. That just sounds like a terrible idea. It sounds very, very painful versus using some other paradigm.
Yeah,
So
that sounds gross.
yeah, it sounds awful.
Yeah, and it's sort of the hammer and nail
Right.
situation,
Yeah.
right? So, and you know, I still know people that figure everything can and should be done in relational databases, and that's just how it is, and that's how it will always be, and so forth. But there's a reason that other types of databases exist in this world, and there's a reason there's like a new one. It seems like every week coming out. So people aren't satisfied.
Exactly right. And I think as we talk about frequently, the goal is to kind of overcome shiny object syndrome and find the right balance between having a lot of tools and too few tools. You know, somewhere in between is kind of your optimal point for letting your engineers work really well on their problems without ending up with massive tech debt and technology sprawl in your organization.
Mm-hmm. And I would say when ELT came about, like that opened the floodgates for, I think, kind of rethinking, data pipelines and data pipeline tools. And in fact, I would argue that it made life a lot simpler for people because once you load your raw data in, you could even just write simple SQL and transform the data and load that into a new table. And you didn't have to have all this convoluted, you know, ETL processes, kind of like what you have in traditional tools.
Yeah,
And
and
you have
again,
things like DBT coming out, which was
yep.
cool as hell. Like that's awesome that that's out. So
Yeah, I mean, I think I tend to argue that SQL is a more powerful language than people give it credit for, that a lot of the limitations of SQL are actually just writing bad SQL, which many of us have done in our careers.
yeah,
But there are limitations to SQL, right? Like SQL is not, it doesn't template, it doesn't handle loops and a lot of other structures. And so, the kind of SQL++ model where we add another layer that manages our SQL makes it much more compelling. And then you get to take advantage of the fact that, Snowflake and BigQuery have just hyper optimized SQL under the hood. And then you can use that as your runner engine, but have another layer above that that manages some of the orchestration of all those pieces and the templating and everything else.
yeah. I mean, what are your thoughts on data scientists who basically bundle all their data in Pandas, for example, and don't use SQL?
I think we both have strong
Loaded
opinions.
question.
Yeah, I mean, I think Pandas is great for some level of exploration, but I think you're missing out on the real possibilities of scalability of using a different tool, right?
hmm
The nice thing about like a Snowflake, for example, is that you can do that exploration if you're good at SQL, but you can do it on terabytes of data suddenly without breaking the sweat. Like you don't have to worry about moving the data around so much, getting it onto your laptop, getting it off of your laptop. I've seen a lot of interesting articles about the performance of some of these like single machine based tools, and they've been optimized, right? Like some of these tools will run really, really fast on a single laptop. But that ignores all the other friction in the workflow, like just getting the data on and off, plus the fact that you can't really collaborate if you're working on a single machine. Like you can't have multiple people
Yeah.
exploration
I mean, you see
together.
things like Dask, I think attempt to try and distribute out the computations that you would do in Pandas and such. But even then, I would make an argument, and this is coming from somebody who's been using Pandas for a really long time. It's a good tool, but my recommendation is definitely if you can do it in SQL, just do it in SQL. I don't know why you would do it in Pandas, but
Yeah.
you
And
know,
then when you hit the wall on what SQL is good for, it can do almost anything, but at some point it just becomes an awkward language. Then maybe Spark is your tool, right? Because then you get that Pandas data frame type paradigm, but you're operating on a much larger scale. And especially with modern like Databricks, where it's very ephemeral, you just spin it up on the fly and then spin it down again. You don't have the massive cost overhead of trying to spin that up like you used to.
yeah, especially things like pivoting. I mean, there's built-in functions in some more modern data warehouses to pivot, but I would say that's one attraction with Pandas is just pivoting is like super simple, but
Yeah.
um, so, but yeah,
I guess
I would say it's kind of an anti-pattern because again, I see a lot of data scientists. This isn't a knock or anything, but just firing up the good old notebook and not taking advantage of, as we talked about earlier, the fact that instead of analyzing the entire data set, now you're just taking samples. Like,
right.
and it's kind of silly when you can just look at the entire data set. Like, why would you
Yeah.
do that? So,
Well, not only that, but how much time does it take you to take that sample? And then what if you want to change sample? All of those steps are actually extremely awkward and take a lot of time. And it comes back to the old saw about data scientists spending 80% of their time obtaining and cleaning data. You can reduce that time at least somewhat by using an appropriately scalable tool that takes care of some of those details for you.
yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, it all comes back to data pipelines. I would say good data pipelines means good data hygiene, which means you don't have to have people going into um, firing up the pandas and Jupyter and
Right.
going through the data. I mean, if your pipelines are in good shape, it should alleviate a lot of that work that data scientists spend all their time doing in the first place, right? So
Yeah. And ideally, again, in the modern paradigm, whether you're doing ETL or ELT, hopefully you're keeping all of that raw data around so that if you have, you know, a SQL script that's really like 30-stage pipeline, and you see something that's off with the data, you can go through that SQL and go through the different stages of the pipeline, retransform and say, oh, right here, I can see there's a problem in the data, and then go talk to your ETL team or go rebuild the pipelines yourself, depending on how the management structure is set up.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this brings up another interesting point. I mean, you know, the term analytics engineering is, I think, coming into vogue. You know, I think it was coined to the locally optimistic community, and then we're starting to see job titles with this now. And what I find interesting is that there's a movement to make data pipelines more programmatic, you know, in some circles, and so it poses an interesting, you know, kind of fork in the road, really, because on one hand you have your GUI-based data pipeline tools, you know, your you know, more modern ones like Matillion, which are awesome and fantastic, and on the other hand you have you know, code. So anything, you know, DBT for your transformations, all the way to like, you know, writing lambdas or whatever you want to pipe your data in, or using Fivetran just to automate that. But it's interesting because what I'm starting to see is there's a desire for the analytics community to start adopting more code-based tools for data pipelines, which wasn't always the case. I mean, it was always graphical based tools. So
yeah, I think part of the problem here is that I think anything that claims to be a no-code solution is mostly marketing speak, right? I think Matillion is a fantastic platform, but if you get into like serious extraction, you're going to be writing code. That's just the reality. Yeah. The one that really irritates me and has, you know, all the way back since I've known about SQL is the claim that SQL is not really code, right? And Oracle has been pitching it this way since they introduced their own database products back in the day to like try to get people into the ecosystem. And first of all, it's definitely code. And second, if you treat it as not code, then the quality of your code goes way down, right? If you don't have coding standards and you don't check things in and you don't review each other's work.
Yeah, well, that's going to be a big, I think a big, what should we say, learning experience for analytics engineers is adopting a lot of the rigor that software engineers have had for a while.
Exactly. Yeah. And in so doing, the quality of what they produce will go way, way up, I think. I think that's what we've seen with our clients as well, that start thinking about SQL as a real language and it becomes much more powerful, actually.
Yep. Yeah. So it comes down to also discipline in your team to do things like code reviews and, like you said, standards, you know, preferably continuous deployments if you can get to that, but that also requires, you know, it's a lot of work to get there. So
yeah, it really is. It's hard for an organization, right? Because there's a lot of upfront work that you have to do before you see the payoff. The payoff might take years to get to. And it's a big payoff, but you have to like invest all that money and get the budgets and have someone breathing down your neck about like, where's my return on this investment for several years before you can see it potentially.
Right. But that's sort of the name of the game these days. I mean, you know, and I think you're having digital transformation occurring, and companies that can successfully, you know, transform are going to see the rewards. Those that don't, you know, they'll die. And, you know, but even adopting things like DevOps practices into your company, I mean, you see a huge increase. I mean, there's some studies in that. There's a book, Accelerate, that came out, which was a giant study of like the effect of DevOps. And I mean, it's a roof. I mean, companies that have adopted DevOps practices they perform better than companies that haven't in almost every metric and by a pretty substantial margin. So, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with DataOps, you know, and so forth, and the effect that'll have on companies, because digital is one thing. I would say it can be argued that data is separate or a subset of digital, but data is also incredibly important these days. You ignore data advancements at your own peril.
Right. And I think one thing that's happened with a lot of traditional enterprises is that they've tried to minimize that operational overhead by being very rigid about how they deploy changes. Because of course, it's changes that break stuff, right? But in the process, they've denied themselves a lot of opportunities for value.
Yeah.
So data
pipelines, I think, will become a lot less monolithic as well. You know,
Oh,
I mean, same thing as you saw in with application development. I mean, basically, I think what we're saying is data is like maybe 5 to 10 years behind where applications are for a lot of companies.
true. Yeah, because it just took us a long time to like start deploying these tools into the data space. Yep. Um, but it's happening now, and it's an exciting time in that respect. It means that there are a lot of big technical decisions these organizations need to make about what direction they're going to go in to start deploying these changes, because you do need some core infrastructure and practices to really get into data ops, but the opportunity is there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. So,
Yeah, sounds good. We could talk all day, but
and we usually do. So, all right, all right.